morning. We're a couple minutes late, so we're going to dive right in. Welcome to this didactic session titled Multi-Centered Pragmatic Clinical Trials in Emergency Medicine, Design and Applied Implementation Strategies for Comparative Effectiveness Research. My name is Jason Haukoos. I'm from Denver, Colorado, and I'm going to introduce my panelists with me. To my left, in no particular order, are Mike Lyons from the University of Cincinnati, in the middle. Rich Rothman from Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, and Doug White from Highland Hospital in Oakland, California. These are our disclosures. The format of this session, about 50 minutes, will follow this. Introduction, conceptual framework, and description of pragmatic trial design principles for the first 15 minutes or so. We will then describe strategies for performing pragmatic clinical trials using a particular model, and specifically the four of us were investigators for this particular study, so I think this will bring a nice breadth and understanding of a particular model that we're going to use to highlight aspects of pragmatic clinical trials in emergency care research. Followed by 20 minutes of a directed Q&A session where we've tailored questions specific to an applied approach to pragmatic studies that will, I think, hopefully highlight and draw out a lot of the concepts that we want to impart on you today. And then we'll leave 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers from all of you. So please, as we move through this and you're thinking through ideas, please don't hesitate to bring those to the table at the end. The goal of this session is to inform your understanding of conducting pragmatic clinical trials and to give concrete applied situational examples from a recently completed large-scale trial. So the term pragmatic is defined as dealing with things sensibly and realistically in a way that is based on practical rather than theoretical considerations. And the notion of a pragmatic clinical trial has been around for about 50 years. In fact, first described in a journal in 1967, although remarkably, it's really come into more emphasis in the last 5 to 10 years. The growth of this type of trial is evident and most recent and notable by the plenary session yesterday. If those of you who were at the plenary session, there were 3 pragmatic trials presented there, which in all my years coming to this meeting, I think that's the first. And so we're starting to see more and more of these types of trials presented. And they're also being performed in high quality and large scale. Decision makers, whether patients, physicians, or administrators, need to know what they can expect from diagnostic or therapeutic options when applied in day-to-day clinical practice. And really this is the principle or the underpinnings of pragmatic clinical trials. As you can see from the right side of this slide, there's a spectrum, though, that relates to clinical trials, and oftentimes described or juxtaposed between the notion of an explanatory trial, and I oftentimes think about this in the context of an efficacy trial, a study in which you want to determine if something actually works, versus a pragmatic trial, or what's often thought about in the context of performing or evaluating an intervention in the context of usual care. And as you can see, there's a spectrum here, and as I'll detail in a minute, there's no black or white when it comes to this. Oftentimes trials tend to fall somewhere on that spectrum. Critical to this, though, is that pragmatic trials are intended to help typical clinicians and typical patients make decisions in typical care settings by maximizing the chance that the trial results will apply to patients usually seen in practice. This is the notion of external validity. You might think of it in context of generalizability as well. Although constructs important to internal validity remain important, and as you can understand, a pragmatic trial, and this will be fleshed out over the course of the next 45 minutes, but a pragmatic trial is not one where you just implement an intervention and then let it go, hands off, and walk away and see what happens. In fact, you have to maintain structure and understanding of research methods. Foundational RCT methods are critical to these types of studies, including true randomization, ideally, although it doesn't have to be. You can use quasi-design studies, concealed allocation, and blinding. Design decisions, though, however, are viewed through the lens of usual care, and this will be a recurring theme in the context of our session today, is that we always come back to the place of how do we inform this trial and the performance of a trial through usual care. PRECIS, the Pragmatic Explanatory Continuum Indicator Summary, was originally designed about 10 years ago and updated about 3 years ago. This is really a construct to think about the notion of a pragmatic clinical trial. It consists of 9 domains, as you can see by this wheel, and was informed by over 80 trialists, clinicians, and policymakers to really help us understand the notion between a pragmatic trial and an explanatory or efficacy trial. As I'll go around this wheel briefly, you'll start to understand and hopefully start to paint a picture of what pragmatic trials are relative to efficacy or explanatory trials. You'll also notice that on this wheel is a Likert scale ranging from 1 to 5. It's a relatively subjective assessment, but 5 on this Likert scale, as you can see, indicates a completely pragmatic approach to that particular domain, whereas a score of 1 on this scale would be a complete explanatory approach to that part of the domain. So as you develop these wheels for the type of study you're developing, the bigger the area within this wheel, the larger the area within this wheel, the more pragmatic your study will be. As you can see from the domains, it's eligibility, who's selected to participate in the trial, recruitment, how are the participants recruited into the trial, setting, organization, how the intervention is delivered and adhered to, follow-up, excuse me, primary outcome and analysis. And this is an example pulled directly from the web of 2 different types of trials. And you can see one in the green is more explanatory than the other in orange, which is more pragmatic. But again, as I mentioned a minute ago, it's really related to a spectrum. The larger the area, the more pragmatic the trial. This is a table from a review article from the New England Journal that I think nicely, it's a little bit detailed, but nicely outlines the aspects of those domains. And it's related to the recruitment of investigators and participants in the study, eligibility, recruitment, and setting. How different, and the way to think or conceptualize this is to understand is how different are these aspects or these specific domains from usual care. The more different they are from usual care, the less pragmatic the study would be. And so the goal in a pragmatic clinical trial is to try and approximate usual care as much as possible. So I want to introduce the model with that background of pragmatic trials. We're going to use the HIV tested trial, which was testing using enhanced screening techniques in emergency departments as a model to reflect on and to really flesh out concepts around applied strategies for pragmatic trials. This study was funded by the National Institutes of Health and is in its last year of funding and concluded enrollment a little over a year ago. To give you a brief background, though, and this is using the model of ED-based HIV screening, you can see from this conceptual model that HIV screening can range from anywhere from doing no testing on the left side of the figure to non-targeted or non-risk-based screening on the right side. And there's between these 2 extremes is diagnostic testing or testing based on clinical signs or symptoms, and targeted screening, which is risk-based. As you can see from this idea, this really encapsulates the spectrum of HIV screening, but challenging was the notion of which strategy is most effective. We split targeted testing for the purposes of the HIV tested trial into 2 different forms. One was what we call the traditional targeted screening approach, which used CDC recommendations for targeting, identification of risk factors of patients based on what CDC thought or thinks is or patients are at risk. And then enhanced targeted screening using a validated clinical prediction instrument that we worked through over the course of the several years leading up to the study, referred to as the Denver HIV Risk Score. We call this enhanced targeted screening. And so the HIV tested trial really was an evaluation of these 3 forms of HIV screening, 2 forms of targeted risk-based screening and 1 form of a non-targeted, non-risk-based screening. This study, as already stated at the outset, was multi-centered. It included Highland Hospital in Oakland, California, for which Doug White was the site PI there, at Denver Health, and we at Denver Health were the coordinating center for the study. University of Cincinnati, Mike Lyons is the site PI there, and then Hopkins with Rich Rothman is the site PI there. The aims were fourfold. One, to evaluate and compare the effectiveness of targeted, non-targeted HIV screening strategies when fully integrated into the ED setting, and we'll dig into this in a minute. Second was to compare programmatic costs. 3 was to compare ED operational processes and crowding. And 4 was to assess patient staff acceptance of these forms of screening. To touch on one point operationally for this trial, it wasn't, and I'll talk about the details of the randomized scheme in a second, but this really involved including all patients who presented to the ED. In particular, to target that third aim and comparing operational processes and crowding, it wasn't just about looking or evaluating patients included in the trial. It was about the impact of screening on all patients, which is a critical piece to thinking about a pragmatic study. This is a schema for the study design. Patients who presented to the ED who met criteria for inclusion, and as with most pragmatic studies, if not all, the inclusion criteria should be broad, should be inclusive of patients who are likely to receive the intervention. And so the inclusion-exclusion criteria were relatively limited. If you could consent, if you weren't critically ill, if you weren't already HIV infected and you have a certain age, we only included adults essentially, then you would be included in the study. Patients were randomized, patient-level randomization to one of the 3 arms. And patients who were randomized to the targeted arms, based on their risk profile, were then offered testing. All patients who were randomized to the non-targeted arm were offered testing. You can see the follow-up out to a year for all patients. We presented the results of this trial last year at SAEM, and this is just a very brief summary, but as you can see from this, across all 4 institutions, we randomized over 76,000 patients, 25,000 patients roughly to each arm, with about 15,000 HIV tests performed ultimately. This is the Presses 2 figure for the HIV tested trial. And as you can see, the area is fairly large, and so really I think reflects the notion that this is a pretty pragmatic trial on the spectrum. And this also represents the timeline. And again, in way of background and just understanding of this trial, as you can see, we didn't start all sites simultaneously. Reading down the left-hand column, we started at Denver Health as the principal site, and then went to Highland, and then the University of Cincinnati, and then Johns Hopkins in sequence. There was over-enrollment at one point where all 3 sites were overlapping in terms of enrollment, but this was a staggered start, and we'll talk more detail about that shortly. So what's unique? This was a highly pragmatic study. It was a comparative effectiveness study. There's high-volume emergency departments across the country, multi-centered. It was screening, and critical, it was integrated into emergency department processes. There were really no research staff on the ground doing any part of the activities of enrollment and testing and screening. So that's the end of sort of the introductory summary piece. We're going to dive into kind of, I think, the next critical aspect of this session, which is really getting the nuggets and the wisdom from the investigators as part of this trial. We've broken this down into 5 topic areas that we'll go through in succession, and I'm going to, I think, serve essentially to moderate the discussion around this issue. We're going to start with regulatory. Excuse me. And the first question really is, how did you handle consent for such a large-scale study while also minimizing the impact on the pragmatic nature? And secondly, were there any unique regulatory issues? Yesterday, as an example in terms of the plenary session, when we saw 3 pragmatic trials presented, one, Henry Wang's study, was an EFIC study. The other studies, as I recall, I think were waiver of informed consent studies. And in this case, we basically sought a waiver of informed consent using the regulations, as you state here, that I won't go through in detail. But the notion that this was part of usual care, that these 3 approaches were part of usual care, and that we could actually, we're just evaluating the effectiveness of these aspects of usual care. Challenging to this notion was the idea that we we had to get a waiver of consent. We could not systematically consent every patient for the lack of ability to enroll patients. A 76,000 patient trial would be really essentially impossible to actually involve in consent, and it would influence their participation likely in the study. So I want to turn to Mike to start, in part, and to follow up on this notion and ask the specific question of this notion of randomized clinical care. How do you differentiate between research and what is clinical care, and how did you approach this from your perspective at the University of Cincinnati?
Thanks. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for coming. I think there's a lot of range in how pragmatic trials are done, and I don't want to imply that they would never have a consent requirement, but this one certainly did not. And when you're thinking about approaching your IRB, you really want to have your thinking straight on some of these things to try to help that move smoothly. And there's two sort of domains that come into it most clearly, I think. One is about risk, and a lot of that is about determining what is the research part and what's the clinical part. And then another is about the practicality. So when you think about this trial, the research part was a randomization that occurred before you ever even approached the patient. By the time you approached the patient, the research part was done. And then the follow-up of their clinical data, which was not unlike a retrospective chart review, in a sense. The intervention itself is not research. HIV screening and testing, linkage to care, it's not research. And being clear about that up front is pretty important and to help solve a lot of things. And what that means is if there's a problem with the testing screening part, that's handled through a clinical regulatory framework. That's not something you report to the IRB. If you change your HIV testing process, you're not reporting that to the IRB. That's not part of the research protocol. That's clinical care. And that really brings up this idea of a randomized clinical care, so to speak. I think that's pretty important. The other goes to the practicality, which Jason alluded to. But I think in that, a big part of it is what is the subject of your research? So this clearly involves humans and their data, but we're not testing the effect of this on any one human. We're testing the effect of this on a healthcare system. That's why every patient in the ED is a subject in the trial. And when you make that leap, and the human subjects almost become a tool, a means to an end, to collect data about the health system and the systems level intervention you're talking about, that definitely informs the practical aspects.
And I'll say one of the aspects of this in terms of the regulatory piece was the fact that we did this staggered approach, where we actually solved a lot of the problems on the front end and helped inform, I think Doug and Mike and Rich can speak to this, but helped to inform their processes with their IRBs. Do you want to touch on that, Doug?
Yeah, I think that was actually really helpful for a place like Highland, which is a relatively smaller hospital with small IRB, to basically have already had this vetted through the IRB at Hopkins and at Denver. It really did help kind of inform the way I approached the IRB, because they had already kind of helped solve those issues, and we had a very kind of scripted dialogue that I was able to take to the IRB, because we knew that if any one site failed on achieving the waiver of informed consent, it really would have tanked the trial, because in order for this to be pragmatic, like Jason had alluded to, you can't have separate research consent. People get confused, though, that you still have to follow your state regulations for HIV testing consent, which each state has slightly maybe different rules of how that goes, but that's what we do anyways with a screening program. So really the challenge here was the research consent piece that we had to tackle with.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. I think the only point to add for our site was that because of the variability in testing practices that were already out there, we had to make it clear to the IRB that there was no real current standard out there, and that the trial was trying to develop what the potential standard would be, because there was some discussion of isn't testing everybody the standard. So that was just sort of in terms of preparation and the discussion with the IRB. What we found was sort of offline discussions with the folks at the IRB to prime them before they did the review was very helpful.
Yeah, and I think in the context of a spectrum of care, there's this notion of equipoise, and this is the thing that we worked through in terms of this trial. Those three approaches to screening were all, I think, certainly at that time considered sort of clinical equipoise, we didn't know, and there had been no comparative head-to-head effectiveness study of these screening approaches in emergency departments. So I think that helped inform the IRB approach. The other point we'll talk about briefly, because this is becoming more and more of an entity in our world, especially in the context of multi-centered trials, is a central IRB versus individual level IRBs. And I feel like, you know, more and more we're moving towards streamlining processes, I think, in the context of centralized IRBs, but we chose very specifically not to do that because of some of the things that were discussed as part of their issues. Every site had a unique issue, and it was, I think, a little bit, you know, easier, I think, for them to navigate them one-on-one, with us at the coordinating center in Denver helping to help inform that process. Anything, Rich? I don't know if you, I mean, I know you have probably a fair amount of experience with central IRBs versus not. Do you want to make any comments on that front?
Yeah, so I'm working on another trial now where there's central IRB. There's a lot of work up front to create this central IRB, but then things kind of fall into place after. Then there are specific reviews at each of the individual IRBs to make sure it conforms with their state regs and maybe institutional regulations. But we found for this trial that having the discussions up front, creating a workflow that made sense and was consistent with all what we knew with state and local regulations was most pragmatic. But I think either approach works. It's just depends on the timing and the size of the trial.
And I certainly don't think it's necessarily specific to a pragmatic type trial per se, but I think, you know, and the other piece to this, knowing that these interventions oftentimes are sort of defined within standards of care, is this the idea of being very meticulous in terms of your rationale about the equipoise and what these represent in terms of usual care. And so that was a critical aspect to informing our IRBs as well. I'll move on to topic number 2, which is in IT, essentially. And I think this highlights, I think, a really intriguing part of this trial, because we wrangled with it for a fair amount of time. In fact, when this study it was funded under the auspices of a quasi-experimental design, not an RCT. And as a side kind of point, when we received funding and we started to work through the processes of the dollars involved and what this would look like moving forward, we, you know, as the PI realized very kind of quickly that we could enter into a pathway of testing, and if we ran out of dollars and if we essentially screened too rapidly at one or more sites, that we would run out of dollars, and then it would destroy or really impact the study design. So this was within the first half year of year one of this funding mechanism, and we really stepped back, really kind of similar to what we do in emergency medicine, right? You see a patient, right? You're not sure what's going on. It doesn't make sense. You step back and rethink it, and we did that with this. And we realized that we explored the idea of actually building out a randomized controlled trial in a pragmatic sense. And I think this is really, I think, kind of one of the more interesting parts of this study, because we built in a randomization procedure into every EHR, all 4 sites, recognizing that there was heterogeneity among the EHRs. We had a homegrown system. Doug had WellSoft, and then Mike and Rich both used Epic. And interestingly, they didn't leverage the exact same build. They had individual builds. So the questions here are, which EHR did you use? I've already addressed that. And will you describe how you used it to facilitate patient enrollment? What approach did you take for collecting data? So these are really 2 pieces. We're going to start with the first part first, and a few slides that come from Hopkins. I'll drive the slides if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, so I can't see those, which is why I'm not doing other work here on my own computer.
Answer an email.
So I think just to speak to that diagram that Jason showed initially about pragmatic trials and the idea of, you know, how to make this seamless, and we were thinking about how to make the recruitment seamless. So we worked, because we were randomizing every single ED patient, like every 4th patient would get randomized to one of the 4 arms. So we wanted to make sure all the patients were consecutively randomized. So we worked with the nurses fairly extensively into looking at their triage workflow and trying to figure out where in their triage workflow they could click a button for randomization that would sort of be simpatico with what they were currently doing, and not getting into the screening questions like at the first encounter with the patient. So they're not asking them extensively about HIV and all these different screening approaches, but they're more just getting them randomized and into the trial. So they decided, kind of in discussion with us, that the best place would be like right after the vital signs are entered, that there would just be a quick question and the patient would get randomized. So then in the background, and we worked extensively with like the IT folks who had a lot of expertise in making these builds, that randomization happened, right up front. They went through the rest of their routine screening, and then if you can go to the next slide, then after that, kind of later on, after they assigned acuity, they would give a lead-in question. So we try to make it, in terms of delivery of the intervention, kind of in a way that made sense, kind of clinically. So they delivered their intervention about whether they'd been previously tested and what their testing history was up front there, and then we went to and then after that, they were then randomized to one of the interventions, either test everybody or ask them some specific risk types of questions, kind of at the end of their triage encounter. The other thing we tried to do was look at this like any other clinical build that's going into the system and teach the nurses like we're just doing a new clinical build, here's how you do it, and did a lot of training kind of in terms of the pragmatics of that was just part of the new triage approach during this period of time.
And one of the critical aspects to this, and I think Mike will speak to an anecdote in terms of how they solved this issue at Cincinnati, but was the notion of randomization and how do you build a true peer individual level patient randomization scheme into an EHR that's working in the background while patient care is occurring. And I know, like, kind of, I wouldn't say stumbled upon it, but really we were working through ideas of how to actually do that. And you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so there's obviously two parts to this. There's the technical part and then sort of the user interface part. And so you can, Rich and I had the same Epic technical specifications, but where in our workflows an action reliably happens that can trigger another action and then something can be done that isn't too disruptive. Just the way our place works is different, even though the Epic was the same, so our build was different. The other thing is that having a person who speaks both clinical and IT is really very helpful in all of this, as is, like Rich mentioned, working with the end users and the nurses iteratively to try to make this the best that it can be. The final thing I would emphasize is just the creativity in this. I think you just have to commit to figuring out a way to get it done technically. Sometimes our Epic build changed midway and we had to redo everything midway through. And then on the randomization issue, when we first started, it wasn't clear that you could randomize it in EHR. So we kind of put our person on this, and they were poking around in the dark recesses of Epic lore and kind of discovered that somebody had built a random number generator in Epic way back when. And pulled it out. But if that hadn't been the case, we would have had to work with them to build it. There's a lot of funny business going on with what you can do with an EHR, and sometimes you have to capitalize on that.
And to follow on that front, after we identified that approach, and each, although there were two instances of Epic, they were on, in the same basic instance, they had to do it differently. They couldn't just take one and plug and play in the other shop. And then Doug's position with WellSoft and ours with our homegrown, we had to create these, but we also went through extensive validation of these randomization schemes up front to make sure that we weren't going to have imbalance and that we were going to ultimately end up with patients who were nicely balanced at the end of the day. When you're spending millions of dollars on a trial like this, you don't want that to be the problem. Let's speak then to data, the second piece to the question, which is, what approach do you take for collecting data? And as I said at the outset of the session, data in the context of pragmatic trials tend not to be very deep, but they tend to be broad. I sort of implied that. And oftentimes there's a lot of data. In this case, we collected data on every single patient who presented to the EDs during the study enrollment periods across all 4 sites. And that turns into lots and lots of data. I think maybe just kind of go down the line in terms of how you approached the data and how, and then I'll follow up at the very end in terms of how we handled it at the coordinating center.
For us, obtaining data was relatively simple because from prior experience using WellSoft, we would have customizable reports based on data that we wanted to pull from the electronic health record. So we just had to be very careful up front based on the data that we knew we needed to collect for analysis when we built the EHR built and the randomization, that all of the key data elements would be kind of accessible in that report. So as long as we were clear up front working with the programmers at WellSoft, being able to download data on, it was actually relatively simple at our site. So that really wasn't a challenge for us, and obviously that's incredibly pragmatic that you don't have to obtain data. It's already collected for you, and it's downloadable and easily transferred to the central site.
Our IT build clinically went through the hospital, but our extraction of data was research, and that went through the university. So the university maintains a shadow record of the EHR, essentially, and it was from that we extracted all of our data. Once that's set up, it's fairly easy to do, but it's still a negotiation to get that data weekly. And it's a lot. You can fry a hard drive with this and plan on a full-time data manager in the part where you're actually crunching all this, tens of thousands of patients. Even just one timestamp is, a lot of data. And I don't know if you know this, but EHR data is not all that accurate, it can be very confusing. And so trying to even understand what your data dump was is a big deal.
Yeah, so one thing, I think those were all like points that we had at our site too, but one thing about, a large academic university and this distinction between hospital clinical data and the research data, we have like lots of committees that have to approve everything. So there's something at our institution called the data trust. So if you're looking at over a certain number of data fields, it has to go through central committees, and then the frequency of the data pulls or data dumps has to be approved and reviewed. So that was something kind of unique to our site, and that we had that regulatory piece too.
Yeah, a common theme, and you can hear this as this peels out, but the notion that there's a lot of oversight on a trial like this, even though it's under the auspices of a pragmatic study where it's like real world, and I think there's this potential misconception out there that you introduce something into clinical care, regular care, and you kind of step away and let it go. In some part that's true, but behind the scenes there's an incredible amount up front and during the course of the trial of oversight and really being careful with how the trial is rolling out. But you want to strike a nice balance. You want to have that oversight, but you don't want to be influencing, if you will, the study. And more of that will come out. We did speak, and I think alluded to a minute ago, but we did, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes, but around the trial monitoring approach that we took was pretty rigorous. And it was Q weekly, large amounts of data that were funneling from the enrolling site to Denver, and basically evaluating how trial progress was going, and we'll talk about that shortly. Let's move on to the next topic, which is clinical integration. I think this is not uncommonly one of the biggest challenges with these types of trials. When we talk about doing a 3-armed randomized clinical trial across multiple sites, with the notion of randomizing 75,000 patients and doing it fully in an integrated way, such that there's not research staff in an ED helping, really. They're there to help support in a way, but they're not enrolling patients. They're not doing any procedural things. Clinical integration becomes really important. So the question is, how did you integrate the trial protocol in your ED? And how specifically did you engage clinical staff? And we'll, I think, go down the line here because each site was really, I think, fairly unique in this regard and built off of one another.
All right, well, I mean, obviously we all agreed up front on some very basic generic principles of this is going to be integrated in triage, it's going to be nursing-led. The triage nurses are going to kind of own excluding ineligible patients, and they're going to click the button, randomize, and follow specific scripts that walk them through the 3 arms, and then getting the builds. And then the challenge was then how do you actually get their buy-in and get them to kind of sustainably adhere to this and follow kind of the intent of the program. And that's where kind of engaging the staff was critical. And we fortunately at Highland, I think all of our sites, getting the initial buy-in wasn't the challenge, partly because we've all had fairly extensive experience at our hospitals integrating HIV screening. So selling the concept wasn't necessary. The nurses understood the clinical benefit of that. The challenge specific to Highland was not yet another model. It had been 10 years of nickeling and diming and changing protocols and making changes. So I really leveraged the concept of we have a really unique opportunity to inform public policy, and hopefully the results of this trial are going to inform the final model, the way that we're going to carry this sustainably at Highland in the future. So I really kind of leveraged, this may be the last time I come to you. And that actually got that really kind of got our initial buy-in that, yeah, this may be some upfront work, but this is going to pay off. We also kind of played kind of to the vanities of the nurses a little bit in terms of the uniqueness of the position that we were in, and that what we're doing here matters. And these are dedicated clinicians, and that you can get a lot of leeway by just kind of telling them that what you do matters, and that the results here really have far-reaching consequences. And then obviously the training, we used a multimodal attack on staff. Really focusing the majority of our work with the nursing staff, starting with leadership, with kind of really early on, just sit down, very casual sessions like, hey, we got this great grant, we're going to really lean on you guys to help us figure out how to enroll this. We identified nursing champions who we were able to really kind of help with our specific trainings. We obviously, developed kind of we developed a web-based PowerPoint with voiceovers that all of the nurses kind of watched. We did relatively low fidelity kind of mock patient scenarios for all triage nurses. And then we did just the standard didactics with all clinical staff. So we met with the residents, walked them through the processes, attending staff meetings, mid-level providers. So it was nothing super unique, but quite a bit of training up front to kind of engage staff and let them know that when we roll this out, you're going to be comfortable in the processes and very well trained. So it really kind of alleviated any of the fears that they may have.
I think having the money in the bank, the trial funded, so to speak, is helpful because the institution doesn't want to give it back. And also having peer pressure, saying, well, these other sites are doing it, that helps some. We had to find a way to send some money over to the nursing side so that they were getting some funding from this, but you can't fund research procedures because that wouldn't be pragmatic. And so that took some thinking. We ended up doing it by funding a nurse educator on their side. We did have folks on the ground in the prior to the trial and in the first few weeks of the trial who weren't directing the research, but they were there to lead them through the screen. We basically had a sandbox type interface where they could get on and enter some case vignettes and see how it worked, and actually have touches on the system before and as we were going live, and were there to answer questions in real time in the initial weeks.
Yeah, so I think kind of the lesson for me was that each place has kind of its own unique culture. And so kind of trying to figure out what the culture was in terms of really getting engagement. And I think the thing for us in terms of how we ended up doing this was to have the nursing, because they were actually doing the work for the trial, truly own what was going on. So they really led the whole training and all of the aspects of how to do the trial. And I stood back in the background for most of that. And the way we ended up doing that was we had a lot of skepticism among our nurses because they said, like, what, you want us to randomize, 70,000 patients? And, so we had them go out to the other sites and talk nurse to nurse to kind of get the reality of what it was really like, rather than, us trying to explain to them. And that they took selfies of themselves when they were out in Highland, or we're out here having a good time in Oakland, and then they basically had conversations with other people who were doing it, and then they figured out how to adapt that to our site. And we have a lot of nurses, like we have a pretty big staff, and at that time we had a fair amount of turnover too. So the other aspect that they decided themselves that they wanted to do was to train all their colleagues in kind of how to do that. So they set up a SIM session, like they would do like any other kind of new clinical intervention. Like they train in different ways, and they said we want to do a SIM internally for ourselves and figure out how to kind of optimize the system to make it easy for ourselves in terms of the build. So they did, these multiple sessions where they had like an education for the nurses. They simulated triage, so they made up kind of scenarios. They had all the nurses go through, watching each other do this, and then they went back to a room and kind of figured out how to address some of the glitches. They, made some changes in how they were doing things, and then they really had like true buy-in when they ended up integrating that. And I think that's the value. Like if you're doing a multi-center trial, pragmatic trial, like if you're at the end, you can kind of watch all the other sites, and see what worked and what didn't work, and then try to optimize engagement. So we went pretty quick in terms of like the overall rate at which people were randomized and enrolled at our site because of some of those learning experiences from the other sites.
Yeah, I think the sequence was really beneficial, and people built off of each other in terms of our understanding, recognizing that each site is unique and has unique challenges. And it's not surprising to anyone likely, but the notion of having champions as part of this is critical, and building those relationships. And building the relationships between research staff and clinical staff, I think, and bridging those are really, really critical. And I think every site did this very similarly, which was a lot of front-loaded work to get all clinical staff comfortable with the approach. In the first few weeks of implementation, staff were fairly present in the ED, not driving what the clinical staff were doing, but helping to support and inform and help answer questions and so forth. But then I think very relatively quickly kind of pulled away as they started to kind of hit a plateau or a comfort zone in terms of what they were doing with respect to enrollment. And I think all of those are really critical to launching a pragmatic trial like this, and being able to really truly step away and allow it to run but still maintain that oversight. The next topic, I'm going to move through a couple slides, is oversight and monitoring. The question is, how did you maintain steady oversight but allow a pragmatic trial to progress? Knowing that the wheels could come off the bus, and if you're not aware that they've come off the bus, then you're dead in the water, and that would be a substantive problem. And were there any instances where you needed to intervene? This next slide shows some data that, some examples of data that we used to track enrollment progress. As you can see, and I know they're small and likely hard to read, but just to kind of walk you through these very briefly, the upper left-hand figure really relates to the number of patients eligible versus not eligible, the dark green lines being eligible. And this is for one site, one part of the trial at Denver. But you can see here that we tracked it over days to make sure there were no systematic or to understand if there were systematic changes in how things were happening. The second top middle figure is similar. It's the number of eligible patients randomized versus the line, which are total number of patients who presented, and recognizing that there are criteria for inclusion, so not all patients would necessarily be eligible for randomization. But as you can see, over the course of this instance of about 70-some days of enrollment is pretty stable. It ebbed and flowed a little bit. The upper right-hand panel really speaks to number of tests performed, and you can see there's a systematic kind of trend down in terms of testing, and number of explanations for this. I mean, some of related to recidivism in patients returning who've been tested or potentially part of the trial. About 20-25% of our population in Denver, there's a fairly distinct recidivism rate. Many patients return visits to the ED who would likely, if they still are randomized, because the unit of analysis for this trial was patient visit, they might decline if they've been tested previously. In addition, some attrition in terms of staff and trying to maintain the enthusiasm to participate in the study. And that was, I think, a substantive challenge. The bottom left figure is the percentage of eligible patients that were not randomized. We set an arbitrary target of 50%, where that would be like a critical kind of what's going on. But as you can see here, the percentage in terms of the dots across days, and we trended that. In this case, it trended down for this part of the trial. And so we were tracking pretty closely the patients who were eligible, who weren't randomized. For whatever reason, a nurse decided to undo the system and not randomize a patient. And then the final figure at the bottom right is really the randomization scheme and how balanced randomization occurred on a day-to-day basis. So you can see the three arms depicted by the different points or dots and color-coded. So you can see that over time we wanted to make sure that there was balance in terms of randomization. We did essentially all of this for all sites in terms of oversight on a weekly basis, had weekly calls with the sites to troubleshoot any issues that were going on. And in addition to this, and not to get into great detail on this, but we also tailored some aspects to different sites depending on what the needs were. And so it wasn't like a plug and play, this is exactly how we did it for every site, but this is the baseline, and then we would also look at different aspects, understanding like whether or not a site needed to evaluate a particular piece of it. This is an example of one part of the study in Denver. Denver, if you saw from that Gantt chart, was broken into two sections because in the middle of this trial, our administrators and our ED team decided that they were going to undergo a process redesign, flow design for patients, and so we had to actually shut the trial down before we completed enrollment because we didn't want that to confound and to really impact the enrollment. So we shut down the trial for a few months, allowed the process redesign to happen, allowed it to stabilize, and then we relaunched. And this is the second phase. And I just want to draw out the dots up in the upper right of this figure. As we were monitoring the percentage of patients who were eligible or not randomized, one week we came upon this problem. And we're like, oh crap, what's going on? And what had happened in a certain area, in the urgent care area of our ED, a programming change had been made unrelated to this trial that had shut down the randomization piece for patients who were being funneled into urgent care. And so this is, I think, a really nice example of being able to, like, in a real-time sense, identify a problem and correct it very quickly. Had we not been doing this and had this happened early on, it would have taken much longer, I think, to get back on course.
Should we just take questions?
Yeah. I think we will stop there because I know we're short on time. We have about 10 minutes left or so. But we'll move on to questions now. So those are basic concepts around this trial. We want to open it up for questions from the audience if you have any thoughts or comments you want to make at this time. It was crystal clear. Jim.
I don't understand why you decided to go with multiple different IRBs. I mean, that would be an option now, right? So why you went with multiple IRBs as opposed to a central IRB and you just have one responsible and you get it through there, then the others will fall. I mean, it sounds like that's kind of what you did because once it fell through, or once you got it through one, it kind of fell through the rest, right? That it takes off the pressure for the rest of them because they already know someone else has done this.
Yeah.
So, but I don't understand why you didn't just do central from the beginning.
Well, to be candid, we were kind of figuring it out as we went, right? We thought about central IRB, but I think central IRBs were relatively newer.
When you're doing this,
It was 3 years ago.
Yeah, they were newer, right? Kind of a conceptual idea, and prior to that, we had all sort of done, and I think we'd all navigated through IRBs. I think doing it now, we potentially would reconsider, because I don't think there's anything unique to pragmatic trials versus not, but in terms of a multi-center study, I think there's efficiencies, potentially attached to using central IRBs. We're launching into a new study around hepatitis C screening. It's going to kind of similar to this, and I think that's on the table certainly. But the truth of the matter is I think we're just moving forward with our individual IRBs based on what our history had been.
Did the IRB ever give you trouble about wanting you to consent that patients actually enrolled into the study at any point during their time?
Yeah. So on the upfront part, we based this off the rationale that the intervention was the screening, right? A triage, essentially. The HIV testing, those who were positive, linked to care, et cetera, were standards of care. We're part of routine care based on that screening. And so, you know, our rationale was that we couldn't practicably, and that it was, I mean, all the criteria for minimal, or for a waiver of consent, but minimal risk and couldn't practically be carried out, were true. From the Denver standpoint, we ended up having to have a conversation with our chair of our IRB to explain this notion to them, because it was a little bit unclear.
Did you consent the patient after, later that day, or?
Yeah, I don't think.
You're in this study, blah, blah, blah.
You couldn't consent every patient, though. That's the issue, right? This is, you know, in terms of the context of the Pragmatic study, is like, you know, 76,000 patients. We'd have, you know, we'd need $10 more million to support that type of a staff,
And
right?
they bought that.
Right. Well, and more importantly, the analysis plan is gone if you have people that are non-participants. This is a health services evaluation. You can't evaluate the health services if people are not, you know, are involved but not consenting.
In terms of, and just to touch on that point as well, I think there's a methodological issue, right? There's post-randomization exclusion issue, right? So if you randomize somebody into a trial and then you go to consent them and they say, what, I'm out, then you've biased and I would argue fatally flawed the trial. And I think that was another, from a methods perspective, I think was very present in our minds when we developed this.
But to answer your question, I think it's easy to imagine. I mean, we just did a randomized controlled trial of 70,000 people with no consent. I mean, it's pretty easy to imagine an IRB scratching their heads over that. And that was kind of the point I was trying to make of, if you don't have this clear in your head before you approach them, it's going to be easy to have it unravel.
Yeah.
I was just wondering about sort of the timeline that you used with your grant, as far as how long it took for you guys to get this up off the ground, and was NIH okay with that, or did you sort of predict that while you were writing your grant? And how did you reconcile all that? We're sort of in the midst of getting a huge biodata study up off the ground, and
Yeah.
wondering about our annual review because we haven't collected a lot of data that first year.
We didn't anticipate that at all. And what I would argue is when you're writing grants like this and prepping projects like this, that there's so much that you don't anticipate. And as I said at the outset, you know, we initially proposed this as a quasi-experiment. And we ultimately decided we had to move it to an experimental design, which completely undid it. In year one, we were sitting scratching our heads, how are we going to recreate, you know, redesign the study in total. It wasn't until the second half of the second year of the 5-year award period that we initiated enrollment. But we completed ahead of schedule, on time, and under budget, ultimately. And I think a testament to the quality of the team and the passion around this topic. But, you know, NIH, my experience, and that others who've had, you know, done similar research, I'd be curious about thoughts, but they're really flexible. I mean, our program officer wanted to be informed, and she was attentive enough, but, you know, at this stage, they were letting us run with it. You know, and this could always move into a no-cost extension post 5 years potential. We obviously didn't have to get to that, but that's, you know, I think the flexibility is definitely in there.
I think NIH might have been a little nervous on the year one progress report when there was basically
Okay,
nothing
they
done
might.
but a conversation.
Maybe. They never said that, but she probably was. Yeah, Henry.
Is anything nervous about EHR data dumps? Because, you know, often you're looking for patients, and
Yeah.
certain cases don't show up in your net. And there's a couple extra fish show up in your net that you weren't looking for. So if you're doing a clinical trial here where there's sort of a burden of saying, everyone, I've got to get some outcome data of some sort. How big of a disconnect did you end up with, and how is your IRB reconcile with that?
Disconnect in terms of patients included or not?
Patients included in randomization and having some kind of outcome data.
So I think, so a couple points to that point. So one, there was a pretty heavy lift on the front end to ensure data integrity in terms of the data quality. And critical, and I think Mike speaks to this like most eloquently, but then in at Cincinnati, they had, I don't know, full-time analysts, but you have to have a substantive amount of analyst time to ensure data, I think, quality. And so from our standpoint, we didn't really see a big disparity. But, the quality of your data are, outside of the fact that it's electronic healthcare data, the quality of that, is going to be predicated on how much you put into it, I think. That's a little bit of hand waving, right? But I think you can't underestimate how important it is, right? As we know, bad data, all of this is moot, right? And so we spend an incredible amount of time ensuring that the data elements were right and that we would trial it. And when I talked earlier about validation of randomization schemes, we also spend quite a bit of time validating data acquisition and extraction from our EHR to make sure it went well. And we would troubleshoot that as we went before the trial even started. What was the second thing that you mentioned?
Along those lines,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking of analogies with daily billing. I mean, my
Yes.
business have patients that go through the ED and they never show up on the radar screen.
Yeah.
I just wonder if
Yeah.
that same thing happened here.
Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah. Well, and it's even worse than the quality of the EHR data because the nurses didn't always tell the truth, so to speak. Like this patient's excluded because I say they are. There's a whole element to the pragmatism of this where you get a lot of benefits, but the drawback you get is you don't necessarily have the same accuracy and control over the data.
Yeah.
But that's what it's going to look like if you're to apply it tomorrow. I mean, that's the
That's true.
pragmatic purpose of it.
I'll leave you because we've like 30 seconds left, but I want to leave you with our 5 top lessons, takeaways from this kind of conceptually. One I'll say is build a world-class team. The quality of the people drive projects like this, and I think people who've done this type of work who are in this room understand this inherently, but I can't emphasize that enough. Recognize that sites aren't all created equal. Anticipate, expect obstacles, and be flexible. Organize is critical to this. Communicate and meet regularly. As you remember, we met commonly, especially during enrollment, but leading up to it. And always in the context of pragmatic trial, maintain a view and manage through the pragmatic lens. It's really easy for us to want to take control and try to influence because it's not going quite as well as you want, but always keep that thought of the pragmatic piece to clinical trial when you're trying to perform these studies. So thank you, and we'll finish there.